A ballistic missile cuts through a pitch-black sky over southern Israel. Air raid sirens tear through a desert city. People scramble. Families hit the floor. And then, nothing. Silence. And then the explosion. A shockwave so violent it shears the entire front wall off a residential apartment building like it was made of cardboard, not at a military base, not on the border. In a city called Dimona, sitting less than 10 kilometers from the most tightly guarded, most strategically dangerous location in the entire Middle East, Israel's nuclear research facility. The Israeli Air Force launched an emergency investigation the next morning because they couldn't answer a single terrifying question. How did an Iranian ballistic missile flying directly toward one of the most defended corridors of airspace on this planet get through? And before you assume this is a regional story and before you assume this is someone else's problem, understand what we're actually talking about. By the time you finish watching this, you'll know exactly why a missile hitting a wall in the Israeli desert is connected to the price of food in your grocery store, the fuel in your car, the package you ordered online, and the cloud services running on your phone right now. What's happening is not just a war. It's the collapse of the infrastructure that holds the modern world together, and it's happening faster than anyone is willing to admit. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to a single date, February 28th, 2026, because that's the day everything changed. On that morning, the United States and Israel launched the most ambitious coordinated military campaign in the Middle East since the Gulf War. The stated objective, according to President Donald Trump, was twofold: destroy Iran's nuclear weapons program and create the conditions for regime change from within. The scale of the operation was staggering. Hundreds of targets hit across 26 of Iran's 31 provinces in a single campaign window. Senior military commanders eliminated, air defense installations destroyed, communications infrastructure disrupted, and at the very top, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei himself was killed in a targeted strike on a fortified compound in Tehran. Let that land for a second. The man who had led the Islamic Republic for over 3 decades, the single most powerful figure in Iran's political and religious structure, was gone. Iran had survived wars before. It had survived sanctions, assassinations, proxy conflicts fought through Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis across Lebanon, Gaza, and Yemen. But this was categorically different. This was not a proxy engagement. This was not a warning shot. This was a direct decapitation strike on the Islamic Republic itself. And Tehran's response was not going to be careful. It was not going to be measured. It was not going to be symbolic. Iran activated the most dangerous escalation playbook it had ever assembled. And within hours, the entire region was burning. What happened next had never occurred in recorded modern military history. In a single night, Iran launched coordinated missile and drone strikes against all 6 Gulf Cooperation Council countries simultaneously: Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Oman, all 6, at once. The Gulf had seen tensions before. It had seen Houthi attacks on Saudi oil infrastructure, tanker seizures, occasional drone strikes. But 6 sovereign nations hit in a single coordinated wave. No analyst, no war game, no intelligence assessment had modeled this as a realistic scenario. And the results were immediate and shocking. Explosions were heard in Manama, Bahrain's capital. Smoke rose over Dubai's skyline. Air raid sirens screamed across Riyadh. Kuwait International Airport's fuel depot was struck by a drone. Fire broke out in the terminal building, airport staff were injured, and flights were suspended. In the UAE, missile debris from an attempted interception fell in a residential area near Zayed International Airport, killing a Pakistani national and injuring 7 others. Iran struck the Ali al-Salem airbase in Kuwait, home to U.S. and Italian military forces, and the Al Udeid airbase in Qatar, the single largest U.S. air installation anywhere in the Middle East. The U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain was hit. Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and the UAE all temporarily shut their airspace. Dozens of airlines scrambled to reroute. Emirates cut its network. Qatar Airways became severely constrained. British Airways suspended routes to Muscat, Bahrain, Dubai, and Tel Aviv. Lufthansa suspended Gulf services entirely. But Iran wasn't done. Because somewhere buried inside the wave of strikes was a move that crossed a line even seasoned military analysts hadn't anticipated. Iran targeted the U.S. THAAD missile defense radar installations, the ground-based backbone of America's missile interception architecture, in Jordan, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. At least one radar system was confirmed destroyed. That mattered enormously. Without those radar systems functioning, the entire air defense architecture across the region developed blind spots, gaps in coverage, windows of vulnerability. The Gulf states issued a joint statement condemning the attacks and affirming their right to self-defense. Saudi Arabia expelled Iranian diplomatic personnel. The UAE recalled its ambassador to Israel, not as a signal against Iran, but as a direct message to Washington and Tel Aviv that these countries had been pulled into a fire they didn't start and didn't want. The Gulf states understood something in those first hours that would define everything that followed. This was not their war to begin, but it was absolutely their war to survive. While the Gulf burned, Iran was executing the second phase of its escalation playbook, the one that energy economists had studied for 40 years as a theoretical catastrophe, always assuming it would never actually happen. On March 4, 2026, Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, not as a bluff, not as a warning, completely and effectively, using Iranian Revolutionary Guard speedboats, naval assets, underwater mines, and direct armed threats to any vessel attempting transit. Here's what the Strait of Hormuz actually is, because most people don't grasp the sheer weight of what that closure means. The strait is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. It sits between Iran's southern coastline and Oman's northeastern tip, and through that 21-mile gap flows approximately 20 million barrels of oil every single day. That figure represents roughly 20% of all seaborne oil traded on Earth, not 20% of Middle Eastern oil, not 20% of OPEC production. 20% of every barrel of oil that moves by ship anywhere on the planet passes through this single narrow corridor. China receives a third of its total oil imports through Hormuz. Japan, South Korea, India, Singapore, Pakistan, Bangladesh, all of them depended on this one passage to keep their economies running. When Iran closed it, the consequences weren't theoretical. They were immediate, cascading, and merciless. Within days, tanker traffic dropped by 70%. Over 150 freight ships, including dozens of fully loaded oil tankers, dropped anchor outside the strait rather than risk being targeted. Iran made 21 confirmed attacks on merchant vessels in the first 2 weeks alone. Iraq began shutting down operations at the Rumaila oil field. Not because it was attacked, but because storage tanks were filling up. Tankers couldn't leave, and there was simply nowhere to put the oil still being pumped out of the ground. Brent crude oil, which had opened 2026 at roughly $73 per barrel, pierced $100 for the first time in 4 years. By March 8th, it peaked at $126 per barrel. Goldman Sachs economists published research projecting that if oil averaged $110 per barrel for 2 months, global recession odds rose by 5 percentage points. Oxford Economics modeled a scenario where oil hits $140 and reached a conclusion that was stark even by the standards of sober economic modeling. That level would push the Eurozone, the UK, and Japan into economic contraction and create what their analysts called an economic standstill inside the United States. The International Energy Agency issued a statement calling this the greatest global energy security challenge in history, a phrase they had never used before about any event in the agency's 50-year existence. Not the 1973 Yom Kippur oil embargo, not the 1979 Iranian Revolution, not the Gulf War. This, here, now. But here's what made 2026 categorically different from every energy crisis that came before it. In 1973, the disruption was about oil. Just oil. One commodity, one producing region, one supply shock. In 2026, it wasn't just oil. Qatar, which supplies between 12 and 14% of Europe's liquefied natural gas, declared force majeure on every single one of its LNG export contracts. Qatar Energy, one of the largest LNG exporters on Earth, could not fulfill its legal obligations to buyers across Europe, Japan, or South Korea. European gas storage was already at dangerously low levels, just 30% capacity, after a brutal 2025-2026 winter that had drained reserves far below seasonal norms. When Qatari LNG stopped flowing, the Dutch TTF benchmark, the key European natural gas price reference, nearly doubled, spiking to over $60 per megawatt hour by mid-March. The European Central Bank, which had been planning a series of interest rate cuts to stimulate growth, postponed those cuts indefinitely. UK inflation was projected to breach 5% during 2026, and then there was food. This detail doesn't make most headlines, but it should. The Gulf states, UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, import over 80% of their caloric intake by sea, through the same strait that was now closed. By mid-March, 70% of the region's food imports were disrupted. Supermarkets in Dubai and Kuwait City began emergency airlifting of basic staples. Rice, flour, cooking oil, prices spiked overnight. And fertilizer, 1/3 of global fertilizer trade, also transits Hormuz, surged from 475 per metric ton to 680 per metric ton, putting direct pressure on the American Midwest's spring planting season for soy and corn. The CEO of ADNOC, Abu Dhabi's national oil company, said publicly and plainly that what Iran was doing was global economic warfare. By every available economic measurement, that was not hyperbole. The IEA took the unprecedented step of coordinating the release of 400 million barrels from member nations' emergency strategic reserves, the largest coordinated emergency release in the agency's history. Energy market analysts were blunt. 400 million barrels covers approximately 4 days of global consumption. It could calm short-term panic. It could buy diplomatic time. It could not fix the fundamental reality that the world's most critical energy corridor was closed, and no one could reopen it without Iran's agreement or Iran's military defeat. Now we get to the moment that changed the strategic calculus of this entire war, and I want you to understand the full weight of what happened on the night of March 21st, 2026, because the headlines captured the drama but missed the real significance. Earlier that day, US and Israeli forces struck Iran's Natanz nuclear enrichment complex using bunker-buster bombs. Natanz is the heart of Iran's uranium enrichment program, the facility where Iran had spent decades developing the centrifuge infrastructure at the core of its nuclear ambitions. It had been struck before, by cyber attacks, by covert operations, but this was a direct, large-scale conventional bombing. Tehran's response crossed a line that had never been crossed in this conflict. Iran fired ballistic missiles directly at Dimona and Arad, two cities in Israel's Negev desert. Dimona sits 9 to 10 kilometers from the Shimon Peres Negev Nuclear Research Center. Arad sits roughly 35 kilometers away. Israel's air defense systems, the Arrow anti-ballistic missile system and David's sling, were activated. Interceptors launched, and they failed. 2 direct hits. 2 cities struck by ballistic missiles carrying warheads weighing hundreds of kilograms of conventional explosives. Residential buildings in Dimona had their facades torn clean off. Buildings in Arad were destroyed. A 3-story structure collapsed entirely. Over 180 people were injured across both cities. The Israeli Air Force launched an immediate investigation. Its conclusion, that the interception failures were not systemic, meaning the defense systems hadn't fundamentally broken down, but that the specific circumstances of each intercept had failed, satisfied nobody. Because what it meant in plain operational terms was this. For the first time in this war, Iranian ballistic missiles had successfully penetrated Israeli air defenses and struck territory within 10 kilometers of a nuclear facility. Iranian state media was explicit about the intent. Tehran announced that the strikes on Dimona had specifically targeted the nuclear research center itself, in direct retaliation for the Natanz attack. The IAEA confirmed no damage to the nuclear facility and detected no abnormal radiation levels, but international law experts and nuclear watchdog organizations immediately raised an alarm that had nothing to do with whether this specific strike had actually caused nuclear damage. Striking nuclear installations is explicitly prohibited under international law. The risk of radioactive contamination from a conventional explosive hitting nuclear fuel storage, cooling systems, or spent fuel rods is severe and potentially irreversible. Russia's foreign ministry issued a statement calling the situation a real risk of catastrophic disaster throughout the Middle East. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu stood at the strike site in Arad and declared that if anyone needed proof that Iran endangers the entire world, the previous 48 hours had provided it. He called the air defense failures a difficult evening and vowed that Israel would continue striking its enemies on every front. Iran's parliament speaker responded with an analysis that was chilling precisely because it was accurate. If Israel cannot intercept missiles in the most heavily protected area around Dimona, he said, it means the conflict has operationally entered a new phase of battle. He was right, and that new phase was about to produce consequences nobody was prepared for. 5 days after the Dimona strikes, Israel sent a message that reverberated through Tehran's entire military command structure. On March 26, 2026, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz announced that Admiral Alireza Tangsiri, the commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, had been killed in an Israeli airstrike, and Katz was precise about why Tangsiri had been targeted. He held him personally and directly responsible for the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. This wasn't just another military strike in a long sequence of military strikes. This was a declaration of a new doctrine. Israel was announcing publicly, explicitly, that individuals who were operationally responsible for global economic warfare were being tracked, targeted, and eliminated. Tangsiri had overseen the IRGC Navy's operations in the Persian Gulf for years. His forces had seized commercial tankers, harassed international shipping, laid the operational groundwork for the Hormuz blockade. Killing him did not reopen the strait, but it removed one of the primary architects of the blockade and sent a message directly to every commander beneath him. The people making these decisions are being hunted. Inside intelligence agencies in Washington, Tel Aviv, London, and Beijing, analysts were asking the same question. At what point does Iran's military command and control infrastructure become too degraded to sustain coordinated operations? The Iranian military had lost its supreme leader, multiple senior commanders, dozens of officials in the first weeks of the war. Missile launch capacity had been reduced by over 90% from its peak on day one of the conflict, as Israeli and American operations systematically destroyed launch infrastructure across Iran. The IDF credited itself with hunting down and eliminating Iranian missile storage facilities, mobile launchers, and logistical nodes so effectively that launches had dropped from triple digits per day in the first week to single digits on some recent days. But as the IDF itself acknowledged, one ballistic missile that gets through can have a tragic result. Iran hadn't broken. It had bent severely, but it was still launching, still attacking Gulf infrastructure, still sending drones and missiles toward Israeli cities, and the Strait of Hormuz remained closed. While the bombs were falling and the missiles were flying, a different kind of war was being fought in encrypted channels and carefully staged hotel meeting rooms. Trump had told his team publicly and repeatedly that he wanted negotiations. He posted on Truth Social that he was pausing strikes on Iranian energy infrastructure for 10 days, until April 6th, because in his words, talks were going very well. But in that same 24-hour window, he told reporters he didn't care about a deal. The mixed signals weren't strategic ambiguity. They were genuine confusion. And markets, allied governments, and Tehran all noticed. Iran had received Trump's 15-point ceasefire framework. Tehran rejected it. Iran countered with 5 conditions of its own: U.S. and Israeli recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, a complete halt to what Iran called aggression against it, payment of war reparations, a ceasefire across all active fronts, and guaranteed protection for Iran-aligned resistance groups throughout the region. These were not opening negotiating positions designed to be chipped away and back and forth. These were terms engineered to be rejected, constructed to demonstrate to Iran's domestic audience, its military, and its remaining regional allies that Tehran was not capitulating, not bending, not broken. Diplomatic activity was happening on multiple tracks simultaneously. An unexpected figure had emerged as a potential mediator. Pakistan's Army Chief General Asim Munir had held a direct conversation with President Trump about the conflict. Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif called the prospect of mediation an honor. Trump shared that statement himself. Oman remained the only Gulf state Iran had not struck during its simultaneous attack on all 6 GCC countries, and that wasn't an accident. Oman had served for decades as the back channel between Washington and Tehran, precisely because it maintained relationships with both sides. That channel was still open, but the window for it to produce results was shrinking fast. The ceasefire deadline clock was running. The global economy was bleeding approximately 20 million barrels of oil per day that no alternative supply route could replace. Corporate executives on a CNBC CFO council call said it plainly. The world had roughly 2 weeks to resolve the Hormuz situation before oil prices reached levels that would force major Asian economies to begin shutting down industrial production. Energy market trader John Kilduff of Again Capital was more direct. He said the world was sitting on the precipice, and if the closure continued much beyond 2 weeks, the repricing of oil would be considerable. That deadline, as of late March 2026, had already been passed. The clock had run out. The strait was still closed. And the economic consequences were no longer theoretical. Here's where the numbers stop being abstract and start being real. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas published quantitative research on the Hormuz closure's projected impact on global economic output. Their baseline scenario, a single quarter of sustained disruption, projected global real GDP growth dropping by an annualized 2.9 percentage points. To put that in context, global GDP growth in a healthy year runs around 3%. A 2.9 percentage point reduction doesn't just slow growth, it erases it, globally. The shipping industry, already under pressure from years of route disruptions and rising insurance costs, was facing structural breakdown. Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd, 2 of the largest maritime shipping companies on Earth, had suspended all Middle East routes. Every vessel that previously transited the Gulf and Hormuz was now rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 10 to 14 days to shipping times for Asia-Europe trade routes and dramatically increasing fuel costs, charter rates, and insurance premiums. Those costs don't disappear, they get passed to consumers. On every continent, in every category of imported goods, the downstream effects were extraordinary in their breadth. Aluminum production across Europe and Asia, an energy-intensive industry, faced severe cost increases. The pharmaceutical supply chain, which depends on petrochemical inputs that transit Hormuz, began experiencing supply pressure. Electronics manufacturers in South Korea and Taiwan faced simultaneous energy cost spikes and component supply disruptions. AWS, Amazon's cloud computing infrastructure, confirmed a service disruption in Bahrain due to drone activity near its data center. A war that had started over nuclear negotiations had now disrupted cloud computing services used by millions of people around the world. Japan held emergency oil reserves equivalent to 254 days of domestic consumption. South Korea held 208 days. China's reserves were estimated at roughly 90 days of imports. India was most exposed, with refinery sources suggesting actual inventory levels were closer to 20 to 25 days, despite official government claims of significantly higher coverage. What this staggered reserve picture meant was that the economic pain from a prolonged Hormuz closure would not arrive everywhere simultaneously. Japan and South Korea could absorb the shock for months. India and Pakistan faced immediate acute pressure. Different nations would hit their breaking points at different moments, and that cascading, unpredictable